On November 16, 1982, Kemp's truck was discovered abandoned on a Wyoming prairie, with the engine still running and the doors wide open. His clothes were scattered along the roadway, and footprints led away from the vehicle into an empty field. A massive blizzard hit just hours later, and despite extensive searches, Kemp's body wasn't found until 4 years later, just a few miles from where his truck had been abandoned. Authorities concluded that he had frozen to death in the storm, ruling his case an accidental death. But the story of Don Kemp became much stranger than a simple case of someone getting lost in bad weather. Months after Kemp had vanished, a friend back in New York began receiving eerie phone messages that appeared to be in Kemp's voice. The calls claimed he was still alive and planning to escape from some unknown situation. When investigators traced these mysterious calls, they discovered they were coming from a stranger's trailer in Casper, Wyoming. Even more puzzling, several people reported seeing someone who looked exactly like Kemp in Casper during the search efforts, as if he was moving freely around town while officially being missing and presumed dead. Therefore, the case developed into something far more complex than anyone had initially imagined. The recorded phone messages sounded exactly like Kemp's voice, with the caller saying cryptic things and mentioning someone named Mark. When authorities questioned Mark Dennis, the man whose trailer phone had been used to make the calls, he denied any involvement with Kemp or knowledge of how his phone had been used. When Kemp's body was finally discovered in 1986, at least one witness reported that it was remarkably well preserved despite years of exposure to the harsh Wyoming elements. This unusual preservation added another layer of mystery to an already bizarre case. The official ruling remained accidental death by hypothermia, but Kemp's parents never received satisfactory answers about why their son had abandoned his entire life to walk into a Wyoming snowstorm. Several theories emerged to explain the impossible circumstances. Some investigators suspected that Kemp had planned to end his own life, pointing to the stress of leaving everything behind and walking into dangerous weather conditions. But this theory couldn't explain the phone calls or the reported sightings in Casper. Conspiracy theorists developed more elaborate explanations, suggesting that Kemp had faked his death due to some hidden secrets from his past, or that he had been targeted by intelligence agencies for unknown reasons. The mysterious friend Mark Dennis became a central figure in these theories, though he was never charged with any crime. The most outlandish theory suggested that Kemp had somehow survived his ordeal and wandered back to civilization undetected, living under a different identity while his official body was discovered years later. Don Kemp's case became known as one of Wyoming's strangest mysteries, kept alive by local media coverage and true crime enthusiasts who couldn't accept the simple explanation of accidental death. The case was featured on television shows like Unsolved Mysteries and later gained renewed attention through podcasts and documentaries, including a 2006 Netflix feature that brought the story to a wider audience. Despite decades of speculation and investigation, no new evidence has emerged to solve the puzzle. Kemp's case remains officially closed as an accidental death, but online forums continue to debate the impossible phone calls, the mysterious sightings, and the question of how someone could simply abandon their entire life to walk into a blizzard. The Don Kemp mystery stands as a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary seeming tragedies can hide inexplicable details that challenge everything we think we understand about what really happened. In June 2009, an unidentified man using the alias Peter Bergman checked into a hotel in Sligo, Ireland, keeping entirely to himself and avoiding all contact with other guests. 4 days later, his body was found on Rosses Point Beach, having apparently passed away from cardiac arrest. What should have been a routine investigation into a tourist's sudden death became one of Ireland's most puzzling unsolved mysteries. The man had arrived at the Sligo City Hotel on June 12th, registering under the name Peter Bergman and providing an address that investigators later discovered was completely false. He paid for everything in cash, avoided conversations with hotel staff, and seemed determined to remain as anonymous as possible during his brief stay. Over the following days, investigators would discover that Peter Bergman had spent his time systematically destroying any evidence of his true identity. Security cameras throughout Sligo captured him moving through the town, methodically disposing of his belongings piece by piece. He was recorded burning clothes and personal items in various locations around town, always being careful to ensure nothing identifiable remained. He carried a large purple bag containing unknown contents that was never recovered, adding to the mystery of what he was trying to hide. Therefore, when his body was discovered on Rosses Point Beach on June 16th, authorities found themselves investigating someone who had effectively erased himself from existence. The passport and identification cards found on his body were all fake, providing no clues to his real name or origin. The Irish police, known as the Garda Síochána, launched an intensive 5-month investigation that included reviewing hundreds of hours of security camera footage from around the town. Despite this comprehensive effort, they were unable to identify the man or determine why he had come to Sligo. Most mysteriously, phone records showed that he had turned off his mobile device exactly 1 hour before his death, as if he had been following some predetermined timeline for his final day. The case echoed other famous mysteries like Australia's Tamam Shud case, where an unidentified man was found with all identifying information removed. However, the Rosses Point case received much less international attention, remaining primarily an Irish mystery that has puzzled local investigators. Theories about Peter Bergman's identity and motives have ranged from the mundane to the extraordinary. Some investigators believe he was simply someone who wanted to disappear from his previous life, perhaps fleeing from financial troubles or personal problems, and his death was an unintended consequence of his plan. More dramatic theories suggest he might have been involved in espionage activities, using Ireland as a neutral meeting point for intelligence operations. His systematic destruction of evidence and use of false documentation would support this theory, though no concrete evidence has ever emerged. There's also speculation that he might have been connected to human trafficking networks, given his suspicious travel patterns and determined anonymity. However, like the espionage theory, this remains pure speculation without supporting evidence. The case has captured the imagination of internet investigators and true crime enthusiasts who continue to analyze the security camera footage frame by frame, looking for clues that professional investigators might have missed. The image of a man deliberately erasing his own existence has an ominous quality that has kept the case alive in online forums and YouTube documentaries. Irish media periodically revisit the anniversary of Peter Bergman's death, but no new leads have emerged over the years. The case remains officially unsolved, with the victim's true identity still unknown. The Rosses Point mystery serves as a haunting reminder that in our modern, connected world, it's still possible for someone to become completely untraceable if they're determined enough. Whether Peter Bergman was running from something, running toward something, or simply chose to end his life as anonymously as possible, his story represents one of the most successful disappearances of personal identity in recent history. Hey everyone, if you are enjoying, do let us know in the comments at what time you are locked-in this. In late 1970, hikers exploring the remote Ice Valley or Isdalen region near Bergen, Norway, made a discovery that would become one of the country's most enduring mysteries. They found the charred remains of an unidentified woman positioned with her hands carefully placed by her torso, as if someone had arranged her body after death. The woman, who became known as the Isdal woman, was discovered on November 29, 1970, near Ulriken Mountain. She appeared to be between 30 and 40 years old, but every possible clue to her identity had been methodically removed. All clothing labels had been cut out, and her belongings were found burned in 2 abandoned suitcases nearby. The autopsy revealed that she had lost her life from carbon monoxide poisoning after ingesting barbiturates, and most disturbingly, she was still alive when the fire started around her body. The medical examiner determined that she had been conscious during the initial stages of burning, making her final moments truly horrific. But what made this case extraordinary wasn't just the brutal manner of her death. It was the elaborate preparation that had clearly taken place beforehand. The woman had been carrying multiple passports under different names and currencies from various countries. Yet none of these identities could be verified as real. Her clothing and personal items had been carefully arranged around her body, along with an empty alcohol bottle and spent matches, creating a scene that looked almost ritualistic in its precision. Hidden in the lining of one of her suitcases, investigators found 135 Norwegian kroner and foreign coins, suggesting she had been prepared for extended travel. Therefore, investigators faced the challenging question of whether they were dealing with an elaborate form of self-inflicted death or a carefully staged scene designed to hide evidence of foul play. The methodical removal of all identifying information suggested someone with either extensive planning skills or professional experience in avoiding detection. Police initially classified the death as self-inflicted, but the bizarre circumstances surrounding the case spawned decades of conspiracy theories and speculation. Some researchers suspected Cold War espionage activities, noting that the timing and elaborate identity concealment fit patterns associated with intelligence operations. Others theorized that she might have been the victim of a ritualistic elimination, pointing to the careful positioning of her body and the symbolic arrangement of objects around the scene. However, no evidence ever emerged to support these more exotic theories. The case captured public imagination partly because forensic artists were able to reconstruct her face from photographs, creating an image that was widely circulated in hopes that someone would recognize her. This reconstruction earned her the nickname Norway's Mona Lisa, as her mysterious smile and unknown identity seemed to embody all the unanswered questions surrounding her death. In recent decades, the case has inspired documentaries, podcasts, and even Netflix productions as true crime enthusiasts continue to investigate the mystery. In 2016, a cold case unit reopened the files, hoping that modern forensic techniques might finally reveal her identity or the identity of anyone responsible for her death. As recently as 2023, Norwegian media reported new DNA analysis and witness searches, but no breakthrough has been achieved. Despite 5 decades of investigation using increasingly sophisticated methods, both her identity and the exact circumstances of her death remain completely unknown. The Isdal woman case stands as one of the most thorough disappearances of personal identity ever documented. Whether she was a spy who met an unfortunate end, a victim of an elaborate criminal conspiracy, or someone who went to extraordinary lengths to erase herself from existence, her story demonstrates how completely a person can vanish from all records and memory. The official status of her case remains unsolved, and she continues to be known only by the location where her body was found. A nameless woman whose death has become one of Norway's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. On September 5, 2012, 4 people were shot and eliminated on a remote mountain road near Cheveline, by Lake Annecy in the French Alps. The victims included Saad Al-Hili, 50 years old, his wife Iqbal, 47, Iqbal's elderly mother, and a passing French cyclist named Sylvain Mollier, 45. The crime scene was absolutely horrific, but what made it even more disturbing was the discovery of 2 young children who had survived the attack. When investigators arrived at the scene en route to Cheveline in Haute-Savoie, they found the victim's car still running with an empty baby seat visible inside. The attack had been brutal and thorough. Over 20 shots had been fired using an antique Swiss Luger pistol, and clothing had been draped over the victims to conceal evidence of what had happened. Most heartbreakingly, they discovered that Iqbal's young daughters, aged 4 and 7, had been hidden beneath their family members' bodies during the attack. The 7-year-old had been shot but survived, remaining hidden and undiscovered for 8 agonizing hours before rescue workers found her. Iqbal's body was found draped protectively over her younger daughter, who had survived the attack completely unharmed. The investigation immediately focused on trying to understand why anyone would want to eliminate an entire family in such a remote location. Saad Al-Hili was an Iraqi-British engineer who had once been involved in reconstruction projects in Iraq, leading some investigators to wonder if his professional background had made him enemies. Therefore, authorities explored various theories about possible motives. Some suspected the attack might have been carried out by a professional hitman, particularly given the use of the distinctive vintage Swiss Luger and the methodical nature of the assault. There was no sign that robbery had been the motive, as valuable items were left untouched at the scene. More exotic theories emerged involving potential connections to international intelligence services or even Irish Republican Army operatives, though no evidence ever supported these speculations. Some investigators even entertained wild theories involving UFO encounters or political assassination plots, but none of these theories led to concrete suspects. The case drew intense media attention, with publications like Paris Match calling it an act of gross savagery that shocked the peaceful Alpine region. International news outlets covered the story extensively, and the unanswered questions fueled public obsession and countless conspiracy blogs. Local prosecutor Véronique Dizot described the case as completely inexplicable, noting that despite extensive investigation, no clear motive or suspect had emerged, even after years of work. The systematic nature of the attack suggested careful planning, but the target remained unclear. Over the years, investigators have pursued numerous leads related to Saad Al-Hili's background, including potential family disputes and business conflicts, but all of these investigations have ultimately led nowhere. The family's financial records were examined, their travel patterns analyzed, and their personal relationships scrutinized. Yet no explanation for the attack emerged. In 2022, French police reopened certain aspects of the case, conducting new DNA testing on evidence collected from the scene, including cigarette butts and clothing fibers. Cold case specialists hope that advances in forensic technology might finally provide the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for over a decade. As of 2024, forensic teams were still working on retesting physical evidence, but no arrests have been made and no new suspects have been identified. The case remains one of France's most baffling unsolved mass elimination cases, with investigators no closer to understanding why 4 people lost their lives on that remote mountain road. The surviving children, now young adults, remain the only witnesses to what happened that day. but they were too young at the time to provide useful information about their attackers. The 7-year-old who was shot has recovered physically, but both children carry the psychological trauma of that terrible day. The Chevaline shooting stands as a stark reminder that sometimes even the most thorough investigations fail to provide answers, leaving families destroyed and communities haunted by inexplicable violence that seems to have emerged from nowhere and disappeared just as mysteriously. The disappearance of 21-year-old Elisa Lam at Los Angeles' notorious Cecil Hotel became a global sensation that continues to puzzle investigators and captivate internet audiences more than a decade later. In January 2013, Lam, a Canadian student visiting Los Angeles, was last seen on hotel security cameras acting in ways that seemed completely inexplicable. The security footage, captured on January 31st, 2013, showed Lam alone in a hotel elevator, behaving in ways that appeared both bizarre and deeply unsettling. She could be seen sliding against the elevator walls, peeking out into the hallway repeatedly, and raising her arms in odd gestures, as if responding to someone or something that wasn't visible on camera. The elevator appeared to be malfunctioning, with doors remaining open for extended periods, while Lam moved in and out of the car in ways that seemed almost like a strange dance or ritual. The footage became one of the most analyzed pieces of security video in internet history. A few days after this elevator encounter, Lam's body was discovered floating in a water tank on the hotel's roof. The tank was approximately 1.5 meters deep and covered by a heavy locked lid, raising immediate questions about how she could have accessed it on her own. The discovery came only after hotel guests had been complaining for days about discolored water coming from their taps, and some had reported feeling ill after drinking or bathing in the water. When maintenance workers finally investigated the hotel's water system, they made the grim discovery that had been affecting the building's water supply. Therefore, investigators faced the challenging question of how a young woman could have reached a rooftop water tank that required climbing up exterior fire escapes and moving a heavy lid that normally required multiple people to operate. The tank opening was not easily accessible, and there were no obvious signs of how Lam had managed to enter the water. The autopsy found no evidence of physical trauma or foul play on Lam's body. Blood tests revealed only trace amounts of her prescribed bipolar medication, suggesting she may not have been taking her antidepressants as directed. Her body was found wearing only a shirt, with her other clothes floating nearby in the tank. Most disturbing was the finding that she had inhaled water, indicating she was still alive when she entered the tank. The official cause of death was ruled accidental drowning, but this determination left many questions unanswered and sparked countless conspiracy theories. The Cecil Hotel's dark history added fuel to the speculation surrounding Lam's death. The hotel had been associated with several notorious serial killers, including Richard Ramirez and Jack Unterweger, who had both stayed there while committing crimes in Los Angeles. This connection led some to suggest that darker forces were at work. Investigators found no evidence of forced entry to the roof area, and security footage showed no one else accessing the area around the time of Lam's disappearance. The discovery that 2 tank lids had been propped open only complicated the investigation further, as it was unclear who had opened them or why. Various theories emerged to explain the impossible circumstances. Some investigators believed Lam had experienced a psychotic episode related to her mental health condition, causing her to climb into the tank during a period of confusion or delusion. Others suspected foul play, suggesting that someone had forced her into the tank and then staged the scene to look like an accident. Unsubstantiated theories ranged from gang involvement to occult rituals, though no evidence supported these more extreme explanations. The elevator footage became viral content worldwide, with millions of viewers analyzing every frame for clues about what Lam might have been responding to. Some claimed to see supernatural elements in her movements, while others suggested she was clearly experiencing a mental health crisis. Amateur investigators like YouTuber Philip DeFranco and numerous podcasters helped popularize the case, turning it into one of the most discussed mysteries on the internet. The bizarre nature of the security footage and the impossible logistics of accessing the water tank created a perfect storm of public fascination. Lam's family filed a lawsuit against the Cecil Hotel, claiming negligence in providing adequate security and safe facilities. However, the lawsuit was ultimately dismissed, as investigators could not prove that the hotel was responsible for her death. The Los Angeles Police Department's case file remains closed, with the official determination being accidental death by drowning. In 2015, the coroner's office reaffirmed this ruling after completing all toxicology analysis, and no new evidence has emerged since then. The Cecil Hotel itself was eventually closed and is being redeveloped, making the roof tank forever inaccessible and ensuring that this particular mystery can never be fully investigated again. Elisa Lam's case remains one of the most haunting examples of how modern surveillance technology can document mysterious events without providing satisfactory explanations for what really happened. On August 18, 1970, 4 high-ranking ANC activists vanished while attempting to return secretly to South Africa from exile, creating a mystery that would remain unsolved for decades. Flag Boshilo, Castro Dolo, Victor Ndaba, and Bob Zulu were last seen attempting to cross the Zambezi River into what was then Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia. The 4 men were traveling by boat across the Zambezi River, trying to avoid the extensive patrol networks that monitored official border crossings. Their mission was to return clandestinely to South Africa to continue their political activities against the apartheid regime, but they never reached their destination. No trace of the 4 activists was found for decades following their disappearance. During the apartheid era, their families could only hold memorial services without bodies, never knowing for certain what had happened to their loved ones. It wasn't until after the fall of apartheid that investigators began to piece together what had likely occurred on that August night. Conversations with local tribal communities revealed stories of foreign fighters who had been betrayed to South African security forces while attempting to cross the border. Therefore, it became clear that the 4 men had likely been ambushed by apartheid operatives who had received advance information about their crossing attempt. The evidence suggested that someone with knowledge of their plans had informed South African forces, allowing them to set up an ambush on the far side of the river. Local folklore among the communities near the crossing point spoke of South African troops waiting in concealment for the activists to arrive. According to these accounts, the men were captured immediately upon reaching the shore and were never seen alive again. The case represents one of many disappearances that occurred during the apartheid era, when political opponents of the regime would simply vanish without official explanation or investigation. During apartheid, such disappearances were often covered up or dismissed as people who had simply left the country. The ANC and other liberation organizations strongly believe that the 4 men were betrayed by informants working for the South African security services. Intelligence agencies were known to have infiltrated anti-apartheid groups and often used inside information to eliminate key figures. Conspiracy theories emerged suggesting that the men might have been double agents themselves, or that they had been captured and tortured in secret prisons for information before being eliminated. However, no evidence has ever emerged to support these more complex theories. After 1994, when the new South African government came to power, an official inquiry was launched to investigate the disappearance. However, the investigation remained incomplete due to the destruction of many apartheid-era records and the unwillingness of former security personnel to cooperate. Namibia's Truth and Reconciliation Commission held hearings in 2005, specifically addressing this disappearance, but the available records remained sparse and inconclusive. Many of the individuals who might have had knowledge of what happened had either passed away or refused to provide information. The families of the 4 men fought for years to have their loved ones legally declared dead so they could receive some form of closure. This legal recognition finally came years after the new government took power, though it provided little comfort without knowing the exact circumstances of their deaths. In 2020, a South African newspaper reported on newly unsealed archives that corroborated the local accounts of an ambush, providing some official confirmation of what community members had long suspected. However, no bodies were ever recovered, and no individuals were ever charged in connection with their disappearance. The Flag Boshielo Trust was established to honor the memory of the 4 men and to continue their work towards social justice in South Africa. Their story has become a symbol of the many activists who sacrificed their lives in the struggle against apartheid, often dying in circumstances that remain unknown. The case of the Zambezi 4, as they became known, represents the broader tragedy of apartheid-era disappearances. Families left without answers, communities that lost their leaders, and a systematic campaign of elimination that was designed to leave no traces behind. Jeremy Burt was a 33-year-old father who vanished in February 2007 under circumstances so suspicious that investigators immediately suspected foul play. On February 11th, he borrowed his ex-wife's car to meet a friend, but he never arrived at his destination, launching a mystery that continues to baffle Idaho authorities. Shortly after Jeremy's disappearance, his ex-wife Kim began receiving a series of ominous text messages that appeared to come from Jeremy's phone. The messages claimed that he was planning to disappear and start over, suggesting that his vanishing had been voluntary rather than the result of foul play. When Kim reported him missing to authorities, police initially treated the case as a possible voluntary disappearance based on the text messages. However, 3 months later, when Jeremy's burnt Mercury Cougar was discovered in a remote canyon in the Owyhee Desert, the investigation took a much darker turn. The vehicle was found completely engulfed in flames on an isolated dirt road, with no witnesses in the area. Despite the thorough burning, investigators could find no clear cause for the fire, and most importantly, there was no sign of Jeremy anywhere near the wreckage. Therefore, investigators began to suspect that the text messages might have been sent by someone other than Jeremy, possibly to create a false impression that he had left voluntarily. The remote location where his car was discovered suggested that someone had deliberately chosen a place where the evidence would be unlikely to be found quickly. The case became even more complex when authorities learned about Jeremy's recent discovery of potential criminal activity by someone close to him. He had been secretly gathering evidence against his former girlfriend, who also happened to be his attorney, after uncovering what appeared to be forgeries and bribery in her legal practice. Jeremy had been documenting these alleged crimes and was preparing to testify against her in legal proceedings. Investigators suspected that his disappearance might be connected to his plan to expose these activities, creating a powerful motive for someone to silence him. The ex-attorney, Jeannie Braun, became a person of interest in Jeremy's disappearance, especially after she was later convicted of fraud in unrelated cases that supported Jeremy's suspicions about her criminal activities. However, she was never charged with anything related to Jeremy's fate and consistently denied any involvement in his disappearance. Jeremy's personal diary, which might have contained crucial evidence about what he had discovered, was never found, despite extensive searches of his property and known locations. The missing diary became a central element in the investigation, as it might have documented the evidence he was gathering. Police considered several theories about what had happened to Jeremy. The official investigation focused on the possibility of foul play connected to his planned testimony against Braun, suggesting that someone might have eliminated him to prevent him from exposing criminal activities. Alternative theories suggested that Jeremy might have actually staged his own disappearance to escape legal or financial troubles, though this seemed unlikely given his close relationship with his child and his commitment to his parental responsibilities. Online investigators developed more exotic theories, including possible involvement with drug trafficking or organized crime, but no evidence ever emerged to support these speculations. The case received local media coverage but never gained national attention, leaving it primarily in the hands of amateur investigators who continue to analyze the available evidence in online forums. Jeremy's family has kept his memory alive through periodic media appearances and continued pressure on authorities to solve the case. A podcast episode in 2021 re-examined the case and brought renewed attention to the mystery, but no new evidence emerged that could definitively answer what happened to Jeremy Burt. Idaho police periodically review the evidence in Jeremy's case, but no arrests have been made and no body has been recovered. Jeannie Braun continues to deny involvement, and without physical evidence or witnesses, the case remains at a standstill. Jeremy Burt remains officially listed as a missing person, his fate unknown despite strong suspicions that he met with foul play. His case serves as a reminder that sometimes people who try to expose wrongdoing become victims themselves, vanishing into mysteries that may never be solved. Hey everyone, it's here again with a quick reminder to let us know in the comments at what time you are W-thing this. On May 24th, 1990, 30-year-old Paige Renkowski was driving home alone on Interstate 96 near Fowlerville, Michigan, when her life took a terrifying turn that would make her one of the state's most haunting unsolved disappearances. Late that night, a witness observed her pulled over on the shoulder, apparently talking to two men standing beside a maroon minivan. Hours later, Paige's car was discovered still idling on the roadside with the keys in the ignition and the engine running, but Paige herself had completely vanished. Her shoes and purse were left behind in the vehicle, and there were no signs of a struggle, making her disappearance all the more mysterious. The witness who had seen her talking to the two men described them as nice-looking individuals who didn't appear threatening or suspicious. The maroon minivan they were driving was never identified despite extensive investigation, and it was never seen in the area again after that night. Investigators immediately launched one of the largest search operations in Michigan history, combing the surrounding areas for any trace of Paige or clues about what might have happened to her. Despite the massive effort involving hundreds of volunteers and professional search teams, no evidence of her fate was ever discovered. Therefore, the case quickly became the subject of intense speculation and theory building. Law enforcement initially investigated the possibility of a highway robbery gone wrong, or a random abduction by the two men from the minivan. The remote location and late hours suggested that Paige had been targeted by opportunistic criminals who saw a lone woman as an easy victim. In the early days of the investigation, Rumors circulated about possible cult involvement in Page's disappearance, though these theories were later debunked by investigators, who found no evidence to support such claims. The cult theories likely arose from the mysterious nature of her vanishing and the lack of any obvious motive. More grounded theories focused on the possibility that Page had been abducted by one or both of the men from the minivan and taken to a secondary location where she was harmed. This theory seemed most consistent with the witness account and the fact that her car was left running as if she had expected to return quickly. Some investigators and amateur researchers have suggested that there may have been police missteps in the early investigation that allowed crucial evidence to be lost or overlooked. However, no specific errors have been definitively identified that would have changed the outcome. The case gained national attention and was featured on television shows like Unsolved Mysteries, bringing Page's story to audiences across the country. Her family conducted extensive publicity campaigns, hoping that someone with information would come forward. But these efforts never produced the breakthrough they desperately sought. Over the years, the local community has marked anniversaries of Page's disappearance with renewed search efforts and media appeals. These commemorative activities have helped keep her case in the public eye, ensuring that her story hasn't been forgotten despite the passage of time. In 2013, nearly 23 years after her disappearance, authorities reopened the case and questioned new persons of interest who had come to their attention. However, this renewed investigation did not produce any major breakthroughs or lead to arrests. Online investigators and true crime enthusiasts continue to circulate photographs and potential leads related to Page's case, maintaining hope that someone, somewhere, has information that could finally solve the mystery. Social media has given new life to cold cases like Page's, allowing amateur detectives to share theories and information in ways that weren't possible when she first disappeared. Despite more than 30 years of investigation and countless hours of volunteer effort, Page Wrenkowski remains missing. Her fate unknown. The image of her car idling on that dark highway, doors open and engine running, has become an iconic representation of how suddenly and inexplicably people can vanish from their normal lives. Her case has become part of Michigan folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers that can emerge from seemingly innocent encounters on lonely roads. For investigators, Page's disappearance serves as a reminder that sometimes even the most extensive searches and thorough investigations fail to provide the answers that families desperately need. Bruno Manser was a Swiss environmental activist who dedicated his life to protecting the rainforests of Borneo and the indigenous Penan people who called them home. In May 2000, his passionate advocacy for environmental protection led him on a solo trek across remote Sarawak terrain that would end in one of the most mysterious disappearances in environmental activism history. Manser had been living with the Penan communities for years, documenting their traditional way of life and fighting against the logging companies that were destroying their ancestral forests. His work had made him enemies among powerful business interests who saw him as an obstacle to profitable timber operations. On May 25, 2000, Manser was last seen by local Penan people near Mount Batu Lawi, where he was attempting to reach the Indonesian border on foot as part of his protest against continued logging activities. He was traveling alone through some of the most challenging jungle terrain on Earth, armed only with basic supplies and his deep knowledge of the forest. Before setting out on this final journey, Manser had told Penan friends that he expected trouble from timber company representatives who wanted to stop his activism. His last known interaction was exchanging cash and supplies with Penan people in Long Pasha, after which he disappeared completely into the vast jungle. Therefore, when weeks passed without any word from Mansur, both Malaysian authorities and international environmental organizations launched extensive search operations. Malaysian police and military units combed the jungle, but despite their efforts, no trace of the activist was ever found. Some of Mansur's personal belongings, including his tent, field notes, and hat, were eventually discovered, but there was no sign of Mansur himself. The jungle had seemingly swallowed him completely, leaving behind only these few scattered items as evidence that he had ever been there. The mystery of Bruno Mansur's disappearance has generated several competing theories over the years. The most straightforward explanation is that he died of natural causes while navigating the dangerous jungle terrain, perhaps from a fall, animal attack, or consuming something poisonous in the dense forest environment. More controversial theories suggest that Mansur was eliminated by local people hired by logging companies who wanted to silence his environmental activism permanently. His outspoken criticism of timber operations and his international profile made him a significant threat to business interests that were profiting from deforestation. Some of the more exotic theories claim that Mansur is still alive, living secretly with remote Penang communities deep in the jungle, where outside authorities cannot reach him. A few almost mystical accounts even suggest that he somehow fused with the forest spirits and continues to exist in some supernatural form. Mansur's disappearance immediately became international news, with environmental organizations worldwide expressing outrage and demanding thorough investigations. He was quickly elevated to the status of a martyr for the rainforest cause, with his story inspiring continued activism for forest protection. The Swiss government lobbied Malaysian authorities for information about their citizens' fate, but despite diplomatic pressure, no definitive answers were ever provided. The case highlighted the dangers faced by environmental activists working in regions where their advocacy threatens powerful economic interests. In Switzerland, the Bruno Mansur Fund was established to continue his conservation work and keep his memory alive. The organization has carried on his mission of protecting Borneo's rainforests and supporting indigenous communities, ensuring that his disappearance would not end the fight he had dedicated his life to. In 2021, Sarawak authorities reopened inquiries into Mansur's disappearance after receiving alleged eyewitness reports from people claiming to have information about his fate. However, these new investigations failed to produce any conclusive evidence about what happened to him in the jungle. Indonesian authorities have also been consulted over the years, as Mansur had been trying to reach the Indonesian border when he vanished. Despite these cross-border efforts, no definitive evidence has ever surfaced to explain his disappearance. Bruno Mansur's fate remains officially unknown, but his legacy as an environmental activist continues to inspire conservation efforts worldwide. Whether he died as a victim of the dangerous jungle environment or fell prey to those who opposed his mission, his story serves as a powerful reminder of the risks faced by those who fight to protect our planet's remaining wilderness areas. Between 1963 and 1967, a series of horrifying child attacks gripped the city of Cali, Colombia, creating one of the most disturbing unsolved crime sprees in South American history. Over 20 children were found in the sugarcane fields surrounding the city, having been subjected to unthinkable violence that local newspapers attributed to a creature they dubbed El Monstruo de los Mangones, the Mangones monster. The victims, typically between 8 and 12 years old, were discovered in the Mangones, or sugarcane fields that surrounded Cali. The earliest known attack occurred in May 1963, when a 10-year-old boy was found under circumstances so disturbing that local authorities struggled to comprehend what they were investigating. Many of the children appeared to have been drained of blood through numerous wounds, and several had been found with missing eyes and internal organs removed. The systematic nature of these injuries suggested someone with either medical knowledge or a deeply disturbed obsession with human anatomy. At least one child was discovered with a needle inserted into his chest, and investigators found various pieces of scrap metal near some of the crime scenes, though no clear signature weapon was ever identified. The victims were often found partially clothed, and footprints discovered nearby suggested that the perpetrator had spent considerable time at each scene. Therefore, the horrific nature of these crimes generated wild theories throughout the local community. Sensationalist speculation ranged from satanic cults operating in the area to the existence of a literal vampire-like serial offender who was draining children's blood for some unknown purpose. Some investigators dismissed these supernatural theories, noting that the burial patterns and body positioning resembled grave robbing activities. They suggested that someone might be stealing bodies from local cemeteries and then dumping them in the fields to create the appearance of fresh crimes. More grounded theories focused on the possibility of organized crime involvement, suggesting that the children might have been victims of trafficking networks or other criminal enterprises that were using the Mangones as disposal sites for evidence. The most disturbing theories involved suggestions that the crimes were ritual sacrifices being performed by someone practicing dark magic or occult ceremony. Local folklore even developed stories about a two-headed monster roaming the sugarcane fields, though these tales were clearly the product of community fear rather than factual evidence. Despite extensive investigation by local authorities, no perpetrator was ever identified or arrested in connection with these crimes. The investigation was hampered by limited forensic technology available in 1960s Colombia and the challenges of processing crime scenes in remote agricultural areas. The terror created by the Mangones monster left lasting psychological scars on the community of Cali. Parents warned their children never to go near the sugarcane fields, and local folklore developed around the creature as a cautionary tale designed to keep young people away from dangerous areas. The case faded into relative obscurity until it was revived by filmmakers who used it as inspiration for the 1982 Colombian horror movie Pura Sangre, or Pure Blood. The film portrayed a wealthy, powerful man as the monster, though no evidence ever tied any specific individual to the actual crimes. Local journalist Eduardo Marquez and other chroniclers later documented the cases, helping to preserve the historical record of what had actually happened versus the legends that had grown up around the events. The attacks abruptly ceased in 1967 for unknown reasons, leaving investigators and the community without closure or explanation. Some theorized that the perpetrator had either passed away, been imprisoned for other crimes, or simply moved to a different location. No modern DNA analysis or forensic review of the evidence has ever been conducted, partly because many of the original case files and physical evidence have been lost over the decades. The lack of preserved evidence means that even with today's advanced investigative techniques, solving these crimes would be nearly impossible. Some family members of the victims have continued to push for official recognition and renewed investigation, but there has been no new law enforcement effort to address these decades-old crimes. The Mangones monster case remains officially unsolved, existing in the gray area between documented true crime and urban legend. The real horror of what happened to those children has become intertwined with folklore and movie mythology, making it difficult to separate fact from fiction in one of Colombia's darkest unsolved mysteries. Freetown State Forest in southeastern Massachusetts has become infamous for a series of bizarre supernatural legends tied to a high bluff called Assonet Ledge. Over the decades, dozens of people have lost their lives or disappeared in the area under mysterious circumstances that locals attribute to small, goblin-like creatures from Native American folklore called Pukwudgies. Since the 1970s, at least a dozen unexplained deaths have occurred in the forest, with many of them happening at or near Assonet Ledge. These incidents have included falls from the cliff, mysterious fires that consumed cabins, and drowning incidents that seem to defy logical explanation. One particularly disturbing case occurred in 2004, when a man inexplicably jumped to his death from Assonet Ledge during what was supposed to be a routine camping trip. The victim had no history of depression or mental health issues, and there was no apparent reason why he would have taken his own life. Witnesses who have visited the area report seeing strange, glowing orbs moving through the forest, hearing phantom voices calling from empty areas, and experiencing an overwhelming sense of menace or dread while near the ledge. These accounts have contributed to the forest's reputation as a supernatural hotspot. Therefore, the forest has become associated with the Bridgewater Triangle of paranormal lore, a region of southeastern Massachusetts where numerous unexplained phenomena have allegedly been documented over the years. This connection has attracted paranormal investigators and thrill seekers from across New England. According to Native American folklore, Pukwudgies are mischievous spirits that can appear as small, troll-like creatures with the ability to appear and disappear at will. The legends claim that these beings are hostile to humans and will push people off cliffs or lead them into dangerous situations as a form of malicious entertainment. Rational explanations for the deaths and disappearances focus on the genuine hazards present in the forest. The area contains steep cliffs, unstable terrain, and wildlife that could pose real dangers to hikers who venture off marked trails or explore the area at night. Some investigators suggest that many of the deaths may actually be cases of self-harm that families and communities prefer to attribute to supernatural causes rather than acknowledge the mental health struggles of their loved ones. Others theorize that natural phenomena such as unusual wind patterns, wildlife sounds, or optical illusions created by light filtering through the forest canopy could explain the mysterious sights and sounds that visitors report experiencing. Local law enforcement treats the deaths and incidents as standard cases involving either accidents or intentional self-harm, attributing them to the physical hazards of the terrain rather than supernatural intervention. They regularly advise hikers to stay on marked trails and avoid the more dangerous areas of the forest. However, the legend aspect of the Pukwudgie stories has overshadowed many of the mundane explanations for what happens in the forest. The supernatural reputation ensures that Assonet Ledge remains more famous for its folklore than for any individual incident that has occurred there. Town historians and paranormal authors, including researcher Lauren Coleman, who coined the term Bridgewater Triangle, have documented various incidents over the years, contributing to the area's reputation as a center of unexplained activity. Freetown's haunted reputation is well established in New England folklore circles, and the forest continues to attract teenagers who dare each other to explore the supposedly cursed areas, as well as ghost hunters and television crews looking for supernatural content. The forest remains open to the public, and mysterious incidents continue to occur periodically. In 2016, a man reportedly ran off into the forest and disappeared under unclear circumstances, adding to the area's collection of unexplained events. In 2019, local media outlets, including the Boston Globe, covered Freetown's dark history, acknowledging the deaths and disappearances while emphasizing safety precautions rather than supernatural explanations. To date, no empirical evidence of Pukwudgies or other supernatural entities has been discovered in the forest. The official stance of law enforcement and park authorities attributes all incidents to natural causes, accidents, or intentional self-harm rather than mythological creatures. The legend of the Pukwudgies serves as both a cautionary tale about forest safety and an example of how folklore can develop around clusters of tragic incidents, creating supernatural explanations for events that likely have much more mundane causes. At the turn of the 20th century, a Texas crime case became the foundation for one of the state's most enduring and creepy urban legends. In 1895, Clara Crane, a housewife from Terrell, Texas, fatally poisoned her husband Leonard by lacing his caramel candies with arsenic, creating a domestic crime that would eventually evolve into something much more sinister in local folklore. The actual historical facts of Clara's case are well documented in Texas court records. Leonard Crane lost his life in 1895 after eating the poisoned candy that his wife had prepared, and Clara was subsequently convicted of his elimination and committed to an asylum for the criminally insane. At the time of the crime, there were no reports of missing children or any other victims besides Leonard. Clara's actions appeared to be motivated by problems in her marriage rather than any broader criminal intent, making it a relatively straightforward case of domestic violence. However, decades after Clara's conviction and institutionalization, the story began to change in ways that transformed her from a convicted domestic offender into something much more frightening. Local folklore gradually developed the legend of the Candy Lady, a spectral figure who supposedly roamed the area, feeding poisoned sweets to misbehaving children. Therefore, the urban legend claimed that after Clara's release from the asylum, children in Terrell began vanishing without explanation, all of them having been seen accepting candy from a mysterious old woman shortly before they disappeared. These stories suggested that Clara had developed a taste for harming children and had continued her poisoning activities on a much larger scale. The legend grew to include claims that the Candy Lady had become a ghostly figure who would appear to offer treats to unruly children, luring them away from their families before feeding them deadly confections. Some versions of the story even suggested that her spirit continued to haunt the area around the old Crane cabin. However, criminologists and historians who have researched Clara's actual case note that there is no evidence whatsoever linking her to any child disappearances or additional crimes beyond her husband's elimination. The stories about missing children appear to be complete fabrications that developed over time. Folklorists recognize the Candy Lady legend as following a common pattern of warning stories designed to frighten children into good behavior. Like other cautionary tales such as Bloody Mary or various stranger danger legends, the story serves a social function of teaching children to be wary of accepting food from unknown adults. The legend has been perpetuated through various forms of media over the years, including local ghost tours, internet forums, and even a 2005 independent horror film titled Candy Lady that used the folklore as inspiration for a fictional story. Paranormal investigators have occasionally visited sites associated with the legend, though there is no actual historical location that can be definitively connected to Clara's later life, since she disappeared into obscurity after her release from the asylum. The transformation of Clara Crane from a documented domestic offender into a supernatural child-stalking entity demonstrates how historical crimes can be distorted over time to serve different social functions. The actual tragedy of Leonard Crane's elimination has been overshadowed by a fictional legend that bears little resemblance to what actually happened. Modern investigators emphasize that the Candy Lady myth is completely unsupported by historical evidence or crime records. Clara's conviction for her husband's elimination is the only verified criminal act in her documented history. Nonetheless, the legend continues to thrive in social media posts and local folklore, ensuring that the mysterious Candy Lady remains a fixture of Texas ghost story culture, despite having no basis in documented fact. The case serves as an interesting example of how true crime can evolve into urban legend, with fictional elements eventually becoming more widely known than the actual historical events that inspired them. In 2007, Carlos Camejo, a 33-year-old Venezuelan man, experienced what must be considered one of the most horrifying medical errors in recorded history. After being shot in a bar fight, Camejo was declared dead at the scene and transported to a morgue in Caracas, where he was prepared for autopsy, only to wake up during the procedure. The incident occurred in January 2007, when Camejo was involved in a violent altercation that left him with severe injuries. Medical personnel who responded to the scene checked for vital signs but were unable to detect any heartbeat or breathing, leading them to conclude that he had died from his wounds. Following standard procedures, Camejo's body was transported to the morgue and prepared for autopsy examination. A medical examiner began the process of collecting organs for analysis, making an initial incision into his forehead as part of the standard protocol for brain examination. It was at this point that the impossible happened. As the examiner made the cut, blood began flowing from the wound, and Camejo began making sounds indicating that he was not only alive, but conscious during the procedure. The doctors immediately realized that they were operating on a living person. Therefore, what had appeared to be a routine post-mortem examination suddenly became an emergency medical situation, as staff worked to save a man they had believed was already dead. Camejo was crying out in pain as the procedure was halted and medical attention was redirected toward keeping him alive. Later, medical analysis suggested that Camejo had entered what's known as coma vigil, a state of deep unconsciousness that can be so profound that vital signs become virtually undetectable, especially in low-light conditions with limited medical equipment. It's believed that the severe trauma from his injuries had induced a coma so deep that his heartbeat and breathing had slowed to levels that couldn't be detected during the initial examination. The brain injury may have caused his vital signs to become so faint that even trained medical personnel couldn't identify them. The incident traumatized the morgue staff, though they were ultimately praised for their quick response once they realized Camejo was alive. The medical team immediately shifted from conducting an autopsy to providing emergency care, likely saving his life through their rapid reaction. Camejo himself later reported that he had been very conscious of what was happening during the procedure, meaning he was aware of the knife cutting into his forehead even though he was unable to move or speak until the doctors noticed signs of life. International media picked up the story, with headlines calling it a true-life horror story that seemed like something from a nightmare rather than real life. The case became a sensational news story around the world, highlighting the rare but terrifying possibility of being misdiagnosed as dead. Medical professionals noted that while such cases are extremely rare, they do occasionally occur when patients experience such severe trauma that their vital signs become nearly undetectable. The incident led to discussions about improving protocols for determining death, especially in emergency situations. Camejo made a full recovery from both his original injuries and the trauma of the morgue experience. though he reportedly lost a finger during the confusion of the emergency medical response. He later moved to Miami, where he became a DJ, turning his horrifying experience into a story of survival. No malpractice charges were filed against the medical personnel involved, as the incident was deemed a freak accident rather than negligence. The extreme circumstances of Camejo's condition made the misdiagnosis understandable, even though the outcome was nearly catastrophic. The case has since been cited in medical literature as an example of how extreme trauma can mimic death. Though verified scientific papers about the incident are limited, it serves as a reminder of the challenges faced by emergency medical personnel when dealing with severely injured patients. Carlos Camejo's survival story remains one of the most dramatic examples of medical misdiagnosis ever recorded, demonstrating both the limitations of medical assessment under difficult conditions and the remarkable resilience of the human body under extreme circumstances. In 2018, a Spanish prisoner named Gonzalo Montoya Jimenez experienced an almost identical nightmare to Carlos Camejo's ordeal, but with an even more dramatic twist. The 29-year-old inmate was declared dead by 3 separate doctors in a Spanish prison, only to be discovered very much alive when morgue technicians heard him snoring inside his body bag. The incident occurred in January 2018 at a prison in Gijón, Spain, when Montoya was found unresponsive in his cell during routine checks. Prison medical staff immediately began emergency procedures, but were unable to detect any vital signs, despite extensive efforts to revive him. 3 different doctors independently examined Montoya, and each concluded that he had passed away, issuing official death certificates and authorizing the transfer of his body to the morgue for autopsy preparation. The unanimous medical opinion suggested that there was no doubt about his condition. Following standard procedures, Montoya's body was placed in a body bag and transported to the hospital Monte Naranco in Asturias for forensic examination. The body was then stored in cold storage, pending the scheduling of the autopsy procedure. However, when morgue technicians arrived to begin their work, they were startled to hear loud snoring sounds coming from inside Montoya's body bag. Upon unzipping the bag, they found him gasping for air but very much alive, creating one of the most bizarre resurrection stories in modern medical history. Therefore, medical experts believe that Montoya had been in a state of profound hypothermia that caused his body temperature to drop so dramatically that his vital signs became virtually undetectable. His heartbeat and breathing had slowed to such an extent that even experienced physicians couldn't identify them. The cold storage environment in the morgue likely lowered his metabolism even further, but eventually his body began to warm enough for normal biological functions to resume. When he regained consciousness, he was disoriented and frightened, but otherwise unharmed by his ordeal. The story immediately went viral in Spanish media, with press outlets having a field day with headlines about Spain's living dead and jokes about Montoya being a real-life zombie. Late-night television shows picked up the story, with comedians suggesting that Montoya should be considered a superhero for surviving death. Medical journals noted the case as another example of coma vigil, or profound unconsciousness, that can mimic death under certain circumstances. The incident highlighted the challenges of determining death when patients experience extreme hypothermia or drug-induced unconsciousness. The prison system reviewed its medical protocols following the incident, though no blame was assigned to the 3 doctors who had examined Montoya. The extreme nature of his condition made their misdiagnosis understandable, especially given that multiple physicians had reached the same conclusion independently. For Montoya himself, the experience of waking up in a morgue became an unintended source of fame, though also, undoubtedly, a traumatic experience that he would remember for the rest of his life. The incident generated international attention and became part of his personal story in ways he could never have anticipated. The case serves as a reminder that even with modern medical technology and multiple professional opinions, the determination of death can sometimes be more complex than it appears. Both Montoya's case and the earlier Carlos Camejo incident demonstrate that the boundary between life and death is not always as clear as we might assume. These morgue resurrection stories have become part of medical folklore, representing some of the most dramatic examples of misdiagnosis ever documented, and serving as cautionary tales about the importance of thorough examination before declaring someone deceased.